The sun above Virelli's academy did not shine. It roared. It hung in the violet sky like a white wound, flooding the training grounds with a merciless glare that turned metal to mirrors and stone to burners. Heat rose in visible ripples, twisting the air into wavering curtains and making the distant horizon shudder as if the world itself were breathing too fast. Liam shaded his eyes with his hand and squinted across the vast open arena, feeling the suffocating warmth press against his skin like a heavy, damp blanket. Sweat had not yet formed on his forehead, but he could already tell it would not take long. The sand under his boots was a pale, almost silver color, and when he shifted his weight, he felt the heat radiating through the soles as though he were standing on a giant hidden furnace. The arena had no walls, only boundary pylons that emitted a faint humming sound and marked the limits of the trial zone. Beyond them, high observation platforms gleamed with polished glass, where instructors and medics watched from the relative comfort of the shaded upper levels. Above those, drones buzzed lazily in slow circles, sensors pointed downward like unblinking eyes. Around him, the alien cadets adjusted uniforms, tightened harnesses, and checked the fit of their water packs with nervous hands. Liam glanced at the nearest group. A tall, chitin-covered cadet with a segmented neck clicked mandibles softly as he flexed his arms, the pale plates darkening as he activated some internal cooling reflex. Beside him, a lean, blue-skinned girl with translucent ears pressed a palm against her throat, monitoring her own pulse as the vessels along her neck shimmered and adjusted, spreading heat through a secondary circulatory system. Another cadet, whose skin resembled matte stone, drew in deep, slow breaths, each exhale forming a faint mist that evaporated as soon as it touched the air. Each species on the training field had its own way of dealing with the environment. Some had glands that secreted reflective oils. Others could thicken the outer layer of skin or open crystalline pores to radiate heat. In comparison, Liam felt painfully simple. He had sweat glands, some basic conditioning, and a brain full of survival tips learned from half-forgotten documentaries, battered field manuals, and long afternoons camping with his uncle under stubborn Terran suns that never wanted to set. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the thin fabric of the Academy-issued trial suit cling to his back. It was standardized for fairness. One piece, no smart materials, no embedded cooling filaments, no hidden tech. His water flask was strapped to his hip, the clear container already warm to the touch from only a few minutes outside the shaded staging tent. He looked up at the observation platform where the lead instructor stood, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a dark uniform with silver insignia on the chest. Instructor Harvin was human as well, though older. His hair was mostly gray, cut short against his head, and his skin bore the faint unevenness of old sun exposure and healed scars. Liam had heard stories about him, how he had crossed 3 desert worlds before Virelli's had recruited him, how he had once survived 3 days in a canyon with only a broken canteen and a knife. Harvin's expression was unreadable from this distance, but the way he stood, feet apart, hands clasped behind his back, chin lifted toward the blazing sky, radiated something calm and unshakable. The academy had been intimidating from the moment Liam first arrived. Built into the side of a rocky mesa, it overlooked a barren stretch of land that seemed purpose-built for suffering. Glass-walled corridors clung to the cliffs like transparent arteries, connecting training domes, lecture halls, barracks, laboratories, and simulation chambers. The cadets who walked its halls came from dozens of worlds, speaking dozens of languages, each trained from childhood to excel in environments that would kill most humans in minutes. For months, Liam had felt like the odd piece in the puzzle, the one organism in every classroom that did not come with natural claws or temperature-regulating membranes or secondary organs designed for extremes. Sometimes he had caught other cadets watching him with a faint, curious pity, as if he were a charming but fragile pet that had somehow wandered into a wildlife preserve. He did not resent them for it. At first he had almost agreed. The heat trial, however, was different. The Academy treated it as a sacred ordeal, a moment when raw endurance met discipline, where each cadet confronted the limits of flesh and instinct without the safety net of advanced technology. The rules were simple and brutal. No active tools, no machines, no external cooling implants. Each participant entered the arena with only a standard uniform, a limited water supply, and the contents of his or her own mind. Last through the trial, or at least remain conscious and functional until the instructors called an end, and the cadet would secure a commendation that followed his or her file for the rest of his or her career. Fail, and it would be recorded with equal permanence. Every year, stories emerged about those who had collapsed too soon, or about the rare cadet who had walked out of the arena on steady feet, sweat-soaked but triumphant, like a warrior from old myths. A shrill tone cut through the heavy air, followed by the amplified sound of Harvin's voice. The speaker system made his words resonate across the arena, clear and hard as stone. He explained the parameters once more, though everyone had heard them multiple times already. The trial would last until the majority of cadets had reached dangerous physiological thresholds. Medics in protective gear stood by with cooling drips and portable shades, ready to rush in when someone passed out or signaled surrender. Any use of unauthorized equipment would mean immediate disqualification and an automatic fail. Inside the front rank, Liam noticed that several cadets straightened when Harvin spoke, as if instructed by some deep-rooted instinct to listen when a veteran human gave advice on survival. "The son of Varelles does not care about your rank or species," Harvin said, his voice an even, unhurried rumble. "It does not negotiate. You will not outmuscle it. You might outlast it for a time if you understand your limits. Focus on your breathing, manage your water, pace yourselves, and remember that this is not a test of pride. It is a test of judgment. Know when to push and when to protect yourselves." His gaze swept the arena and lingered, just for a moment, on Liam. Liam felt the weight of that glance like a hand on his shoulder, steadying and challenging at the same time. He straightened unconsciously and adjusted the strap of his flask. The cadet to Liam's right, the blue-skinned girl with the translucent ears, glanced at him with curiosity. Her eyes were a deep violet, bright in the harsh light. "You grew up on a high-heat world, yes?" she asked, her accent heavy but understandable. The question was not unkind. It was hopeful. Liam shook his head and allowed himself a small smile. "No. My homeworld is temperate. We complain when it gets mildly hot." She blinked at him, clearly unsure if he was joking. "Then why are you so calm? Your species has no thermal plates, no reflective dermis, nothing. Your records say you have completed desert simulations, but simulations are less cruel than Varelles." He shrugged. "I am calm because worrying will not chill the air. I am thinking about the problem. That is the only thing that helps." She considered this answer and nodded slowly, as if filing it away among many other strange human habits she had observed during her time at the Academy. In truth, Liam was not as calm as he appeared. His heart beat faster than usual, and the sight of the shimmering arena stirred a knot of doubt in his stomach. The memories that surfaced were not glamorous. He remembered one summer in particular, back on Earth, when a heat wave had lingered for weeks, turning his small town into a place of stifling afternoons and restless, sleepless nights. Air conditioners had failed under the strain. Roads had softened slightly, and brown lawns had turned to crisp yellow mats. On the worst day, he and his uncle had driven out to a stretch of scrubland near the foothills, far from the city. His uncle, a former survival instructor, had insisted on teaching him how to build shade with whatever was available. The sun that day had not been as fierce as Varelles's, but in his memory it felt almost as oppressive because he had been younger, shorter, and less experienced. He remembered his uncle's voice as clearly as if the man stood beside him now. The words had been simple. "When it is too hot, you do not fight the sun directly. You get out of its way. Make shade. Think in layers. Block the radiation. Trap some air. Let it move. Let the world do the cooling for you." Liam had spent hours gathering branches, propping them against stones, and draping them with whatever leafy material he could find. The first shelter had been clumsy and unstable. A gust of dry wind had collapsed half of it, showering him in dust and leaves. His uncle had laughed softly, then helped him rebuild it properly, showing him how to brace the supports, how to think about angles and shadows, how to place openings so that air could flow without letting harsh sunlight in. When they had finally crawled under the improvised roof, the difference had been startling. The temperature inside had dropped enough that he had stopped squinting and had been able to breathe without feeling like his lungs were burning. A second tone echoed across the arena now, lower and longer. The starting signal. The cadets fell silent as a wave of focus spread through the group. Conversations died mid-word, and nervous fidgeting stilled. Liam felt the mood shift, as if the air itself had become heavier with intent. The medics retreated to the edge of the field, and the observation drones dipped lower, lenses adjusting. Above, the sun seemed to glow even brighter, as if eager for this ritual of measured suffering. Liam stepped forward with the others, crossing the line of shadow cast by the staging awning and entering fully into the open. The impact of the heat was immediate and shocking. It felt like stepping into a blast from an open furnace door. His skin prickled, and the air seared the inside of his nose with each inhale. Around him, the alien cadets began their own strategies. The chitin-plated boy narrowed his stance and remained almost perfectly still, conserving energy and allowing his natural armor to slowly shift toward a more reflective tone. The stone-skinned cadet moved in careful, deliberate circles, using motion to increase airflow over his superheated surface, his exhaled mist forming a thin, shimmering halo around his head. The blue-skinned girl closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with a deliberate calm. The vessels in her translucent ears widened, turning a faintly deeper color as she directed more blood toward those cooling fins. Several cadets formed small clusters, perhaps drawing comfort from proximity, perhaps watching one another for signs of weakness. Liam did not join any group. He scanned the arena instead. The landscape at first glance seemed almost insultingly featureless. No large rocks to hide behind, no obvious depressions in the ground, no scattered equipment. Just sand, faintly coarse underfoot, broken only by the infrequent presence of dried-out scrub that barely reached mid-calf height. However, the more he looked, the more details emerged. Some of the scrub still had thin, twisted branches, brittle but intact. A few shrubs had bark that peeled in fibrous strips rather than snapping cleanly. The ground, too, was not uniformly flat. Here and there, shallow dips made subtle shadows, almost invisible unless viewed from a particular angle. The pylons at the edges of the arena cast thin, vertical slits of shade that crawled visibly across the ground as the minutes passed, marking the sun's slow progress. Liam inhaled once, slowly, and felt the heat scrape along his throat. The immediate instinct was to drink, to gulp down half his water and hope for relief. He ignored that impulse. The first hour, he knew, would be the most dangerous in terms of judgment. The body screamed, but the environment did not change. He closed his eyes briefly and pictured that old shelter in the Earth scrubland, remembered the feeling of stepping inside and realizing that even a small reduction in direct sunlight could mean the difference between exhaustion and endurance. When he opened his eyes again, he was already thinking not about how long he could endure the raw assault of the Varelian sun, but about how to put something between himself and its light. He shifted his gaze to the nearest clusters of scrub and mentally traced possible shapes, supports, and angles. The heat trial, he realized, did not forbid the environment itself. It only forbade tools that came from outside. The arena offered almost nothing. Almost. That word bent his thoughts in a specific direction, like a compass needle aligning itself. As the first waves of discomfort elevated into deep, throbbing heat, Liam understood that if he approached this trial as a contest of endurance alone, he would lose. Every alien cadet on this field had a body better adapted to high temperatures than his. He would not outlast them by simply standing and suffering. If he wanted to stay conscious longer than the others, he would have to change the conditions in which he endured. That, more than anything, steadied him. This was not a test that rewarded stubbornness. It was a test that rewarded insight. He took a careful sip from his flask, feeling the lukewarm water slide down his throat, then turned toward the nearest patch of scrub and began to walk, slow and deliberate, while above him the sun watched in blazing, indifferent silence. The moment Liam stepped deeper into the arena, the heat stopped feeling like air and became something closer to a physical presence. It pressed against his shoulders, crawled down his back, and clung to his arms as if invisible hands were trying to drag him toward the ground. The sun above stood unchallenged, its light stabbing downward in straight, merciless beams that left no corner untouched. Even the smallest patches of scrub trembled under the assault, their twisted branches giving off the faint smell of baked resin. Liam slowed his pace to conserve energy, counting his breaths as he moved. Each inhale scorched the inside of his mouth, and each exhale seemed to evaporate before it even left his lips. Around him, the other cadets shifted, each dealing with the heat in his or her own way, though the struggle was beginning to show. A tall cadet from the stone-skinned species crouched near a shallow depression in the ground, lowering himself into it as if hoping the earth might hold some remnant of the coolness lost during the night. His breathing was heavy, and the mist that usually accompanied each exhale had thinned to barely visible wisps. His species was known for thriving in cold, mountainous regions. Heat this intense was unfamiliar, and the rhythmic rise and fall of his shoulders suggested he was already struggling to keep his core temperature stable. Near him stood the chitin-plated boy, who had abandoned his stillness and begun pacing in slow, deliberate arcs. His armor-like skin was darkening, turning from pale beige to an almost metallic gray, a sign that his body was attempting to reflect rather than absorb the sunlight. The transformation, though natural, came at a cost. His movements had grown sluggish, and his mandibles clicked at irregular intervals, indicating stress. The blue-skinned girl with the translucent ears stood farther away, her posture rigid, as if she were holding herself upright through force of will alone. The veins under her ears pulsed visibly, glowing faintly as her body redirected more blood to her cooling veins. She had removed her outer collar, exposing more of her neck in an attempt to dissipate heat. Her eyes, bright violet in the shadow of the staging tent earlier, now reflected the burning sky in a way that made her seem almost feverish. Liam watched her for a moment and saw her sway. She caught herself quickly, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her condition. Other cadets were faring no better. A lean cadet with patches of fur along his forearms and jaw had begun digging at the ground with frantic movements, ripping up handfuls of sand as if beneath it he expected to uncover moisture or shade. His claws kicked up clouds of dust that clung to his sweat-dampened fur, giving him a wild, desperate appearance. His species usually relied on thick canopy forests to serve as natural shade on his homeworld. Here, with no towering trees to hide under, he looked disoriented, like a predator trapped in a hostile biome. A few meters away, a reptilian girl with overlapping scales huddled next to a knee-high shrub, trying to angle her body so that the tiny shadow it provided would shield her from at least some of the direct sunlight. Every few seconds, she repositioned herself, chasing a fragment of shade that kept sliding away as the sun shifted. She hissed under her breath, not in anger but in fear. Her scales were thin and sensitive, meant for temperate wetlands rather than this blazing wasteland. Liam inhaled through his nose, regretting the decision instantly as the hot air scorched his sinuses. He exhaled through pursed lips, letting the breath escape slowly to avoid dizziness. He scanned the arena again. No clouds, no wind, no reprieve. The dryness clung to his tongue like powder. His throat felt raw, and sweat began to trickle along his spine. He could feel his pulse in his temples, a slow, heavy throb that warned him how quickly this environment could rob a person of clarity. He touched his flask but resisted the urge to drink. Instead, he let his gaze move back across the arena, noting how the instructors on the observation platform were leaning forward slightly, no longer standing in the relaxed posture they had held when the trial began. From the raised walkway, Instructor Harvin observed the cadets with narrowed eyes. His posture remained rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, but the lines near his mouth had tightened. Liam could not hear his voice from this distance, but Harvin seemed to be speaking rapidly to the medic beside him. The medic, a human woman with her hair tied tightly at the back of her head, kept glancing toward the field, her expression sharpening each time a cadet staggered or crouched with trembling limbs. Liam saw her point toward one of the reptilian girls, the one huddled in the tiny patch of shade cast by a dying shrub. The girl had stopped adjusting her posture and was now slumped sideways, her body curled in on itself. Harvin raised one hand in a firm gesture, signaling the medics stationed on the ground. Two sprinted across the sand with reflective emergency blankets, their boots kicking up thin trails of dust. They reached the reptilian girl moments later, lifting her gently and covering her with the blanket before carrying her toward the cooling tent. The removal of the first cadet was like a switch being flipped. Panic spread through the others. A cadet with golden metallic skin backed away from the center of the arena, gasping as he clutched his chest. His species' reflective abilities should have protected him longer, but the intensity of Varelli's sun was something no simulation could prepare him for. His skin had begun to crack near the joints, tiny fissures forming where the heat had dried the surface too quickly. He tried to raise one arm, maybe to signal surrender, but his movement was weak and uncoordinated. A medic rushed to him before he collapsed entirely. Liam pressed his lips together, resisting the urge to move toward anyone in distress. The rules were strict. Interference meant disqualification, and worse, it could endanger both parties. He had to observe, not assist. His stomach twisted at the sight of the blue-skinned girl now on her knees, one hand pressed against the sand as she struggled to remain upright. Her cooling veins were glowing intensely, a sign she was reaching the limits of her species' ability to disperse heat. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, and her eyes darted rapidly, as if trying to focus on something that kept slipping from her sight. A string of words left her lips, but the sound was too faint to hear. After a moment, she pitched forward. The medics had been watching her closely. They reached her in seconds. Near the far edge of the arena, the stone-skinned cadet had lowered himself deeper into the shallow depression, curling his limbs inward. Although his species was resilient, the prolonged exposure had sucked the moisture from his body faster than he could regenerate it. The mist that usually accompanied his breaths was gone entirely. When he tried to stand, his legs buckled, and he fell like a statue being toppled. His heavy body hit the ground with a dull impact that carried across the field. Again, the medics sprinted. Liam watched as they sprayed a cooling compound over the cadet's back, creating a thin trail of steam that rose into the shimmering air. The chitin-plated boy, who had originally remained composed, was now losing his battle against the heat. His armor had fully darkened, but the transformation left him stiff and sluggish. His joints creaked with each movement, and his mandibles opened and closed rapidly, a biological attempt to release excess heat, though the effort was failing. When he tried to straighten up, his legs trembled violently. His exoskeleton began to emit a faint clicking sound, the sign of internal stress fractures forming. Realizing his condition, he raised one hand shakily, signaling surrender before he collapsed. Medics rushed to him, catching him before he hit the sand. Liam felt the knot in his stomach tighten further. The arena was turning into a field of fallen cadets, each one succumbing faster than the last. Harvin's expression had changed. The veteran instructor now looked troubled, his brows drawn low. He spoke sharply into the comm unit on his wrist, and more medics took positions along the perimeter. The trial was not supposed to strip the cadets of dignity. It was meant to build discipline and focus. Yet today, The heat seemed unusually aggressive, as if the sun were testing the academy itself. Despite the chaos around him, Liam forced himself to stay steady. His breath remained controlled, but his body was reacting to the oppressive heat. Sweat trickled down his temples and stung his eyes. His stomach churned faintly, and his skin felt too tight. His limbs were beginning to tingle from dehydration. He took another measured sip of water, barely enough to wet his mouth, then capped the flask. His instincts screamed at him to sit down, to conserve every remaining drop of energy, but he refused. Sitting would only make it harder to stand again. Instead, he continued moving in slow, deliberate steps, studying both the environment and the reactions of the remaining cadets. Few were left standing now. A reptilian boy with broader scales managed to endure longer than most of his species, but even he was showing signs of collapse. His scales had shifted color from deep green to pale yellow, indicating severe stress. He stumbled toward a cluster of sparse shrubs as though instinctively seeking shade, but there was none to be found. He collapsed midway, and the medics ran to retrieve him. A girl with feathery tufts on her shoulders tried to create wind by fanning her arms, her species' adaptation for cold climates completely useless here. She swayed, feathers drooping, before falling backward. Liam swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was lined with sand. His pulse hammered. He could feel his body reaching its early limits, the unique vulnerability of his species becoming painfully apparent. Yet, unlike the others, he did not panic. A clear thought pushed through the haze of heat. He could change the conditions. He could still act. But first, he had to endure long enough to act safely. He closed his eyes briefly, focusing on steady breathing, then opened them again with renewed determination. In the distance, Harvin glanced at Liam again. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were noticing something different in the human's posture, something deliberate. He murmured something to the medic beside him, who turned her gaze toward Liam as well. But neither issued an order. Liam was not collapsing. Liam was observing, and that alone set him apart from the rest of the field. As the last of the alien cadets slipped into heat-induced disorientation, Liam remained upright, his jaw clenched, his breathing controlled. He could feel the heat taking hold, but he refused to let it blind him. Around him, the arena that had swallowed every other participant still offered him one critical possibility: the chance to build something, the chance to outthink the sun rather than outlast it. And as the medics lifted yet another cadet out of the scorching field, Liam knew that if he wanted to finish this trial on his feet, he would have to begin that plan soon, before the heat claimed him as well. Liam forced himself to keep moving even as the heat gathered under his skin like molten metal. His vision wavered at the edges, melting slightly as though the world were being seen through a sheet of rippling glass. The arena stretched around him in a shimmering haze, littered with the impressions left behind by the cadets who had already fallen. The medics were busy in the distance, carrying weakened students toward the cooling tents, spraying emergency mist, and sealing reflective blankets around collapsing bodies. But Liam no longer looked at them. His focus narrowed to the thicket of spindly shrubs scattered across the far end of the field, each one clinging stubbornly to life despite the merciless sun. Those shrubs were not much to look at, brittle and half-dead, but they represented something no other cadet on the field had even considered: potential building material. His mouth felt dry enough to crack at the corners. His breathing had grown shallow, the heat making each inhale feel like a struggle against invisible pressure. Yet he resisted the impulse to stop. His steps were slow but deliberate. He knew that any hesitation could steal the fragile momentum he had left. His legs trembled slightly with each movement, a subtle warning that his reserves were running low, but he pushed on until he reached the largest cluster of scrub. It was no taller than his thigh, twisted into strange, angular shapes by years of surviving under relentless sunlight. He crouched beside it and let his hand hover above one branch, testing its rigidity without touching it directly. The branch cast a tiny sliver of shade onto his hand, and even that fraction of darkness felt like a soothing balm. He finally gripped the branch. It was dry, but not brittle enough to crumble instantly. He felt its grain, its weight, its flexibility. He snapped it carefully, using his knee as leverage, and the break was satisfyingly clean. A small cloud of dust puffed upward as the branch separated, but the sound was minimal. He set the piece aside and moved to the next. Soon he had a small pile of branches beside him. Some were curved, some straight, all sturdy enough to act as structural ribs if he arranged them properly. His fingers stung as he worked, because the heat had made the bark feel almost sharp, but he endured the discomfort without pause. He kept gathering materials until his breathing worsened, and he felt a wave of dizziness sweep through him. He sat back on his heels and closed his eyes for a moment, willing the sensation to pass. When he opened them again, he noticed Instructor Harvin watching him from the observation platform. Harvin stood rigid, one hand resting lightly on the railing. His expression was unreadable, but his posture betrayed a growing interest. Harvin had seen countless cadets attempt to survive this arena, but none had done what Liam was attempting now. Liam felt a spark of determination at the sight. If Harvin believed this idea was worth watching, then the idea was worth finishing. Liam tightened his grip on the nearest branch, rose slowly to his feet, and carried the armful of materials toward the shallow depression in the ground he had noticed earlier. The dip was not deep, but it provided just enough variation in elevation to anchor a structure. He knelt at the edge of the depression and laid the branches down in an array. His hands moved instinctively, guided by memories rather than conscious planning. He positioned the longest branches first, angling them inward so that their tips met near the center. He pressed them into the ground as deeply as he could, though the sand was loose and resisted him. To secure them, he used cross pieces, smaller chunks of wood that he jammed between the supporting ribs to create a stable triangular frame. The work demanded careful movements, because any mistake could cause the structure to collapse when he attempted to cover it. Sweat dripped from his jaw and onto the branches below, evaporating almost instantly. He took a slow breath and scanned the shrubs again. The bark on some of the larger trunks had peeled slightly, hanging in long, fibrous strips that fluttered weakly whenever he brushed past them. Those strips would be essential. Bark, especially when layered, acted as a natural insulator and could block direct sunlight more effectively than bare branches. He returned to the shrubs and used his fingers to carefully peel off the loose bark. He avoided ripping it too quickly, because too much force could fracture the fibers and reduce the material's usefulness. Once he had collected enough strips, he carried them back to the frame and began draping them over the angled branches. The moment he placed the first strip, he felt a faint shift in the air beneath the forming shelter. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it encouraged him. He layered more bark, overlapping each piece like shingles on a roof. The bark crinkled each time he pressed it into place, and some pieces cracked, but most held. As the cover thickened, the light underneath the structure dimmed, and the temperature began to drop ever so slightly. Liam worked faster, though his hands shook. His head ached with a pulsing rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. Each time he reached up to adjust a branch or secure a piece of bark, he felt spots dance across his vision. But the shelter was taking shape, more rapidly than he had expected. He crawled beneath the half-finished structure to check its stability. The air was still hot, but significantly less aggressive. Without direct sunlight striking his skin, the oppressive weight eased just enough to give him a moment to breathe more deeply. He allowed himself 5 slow breaths, savoring the fragile comfort, before emerging again to reinforce the roof. He added more branches, weaving them through the existing frame, creating a layered ceiling. The more layers he added, the darker the interior became. Shadows pooled beneath the structure, merging into a single patch of shade large enough for him to sit in with his back against the slanted wall. Liam's throat tightened as he stepped away from the shelter to gather a few final supports. He crouched and grabbed another branch, but as he straightened, a wave of dizziness nearly toppled him. His legs buckled, and he caught himself with one hand pressed against the sand. The grains seared his palm, but he ignored the pain and fought the dizziness until it eased. He swallowed, feeling the dryness scrape his throat like rough metal. He finally allowed himself another sip of water, letting the lukewarm liquid cling to the inside of his mouth before swallowing it. He returned to the structure and placed the last few supports with painstaking care. When he finally stepped back, he saw what he had created, a makeshift hut that leaned slightly to one side but was sturdy enough to remain standing. Its roof was uneven, with bark layered in overlapping rows that blocked a surprising amount of sunlight. The branches formed a skeletal, angular shape that created a deep shadow beneath. It was imperfect and crude, but it was shade, real shade. A shelter built by hand, something that no other cadet had thought to construct. He knelt and crawled inside fully this time, pulling his legs beneath him and letting his muscles unclench. The relief washed through his body like cool water. The temperature difference was unmistakable. The air still felt warm, very warm, but the constant burning sensation on his skin had vanished. The oppressive glare no longer stabbed at his eyes. The world outside the shelter looked bleached and violent, but inside the hut everything was muted. The dimness wrapped itself around him like a protective cloak. He leaned back and exhaled slowly, allowing himself a small moment of triumph. From the observation platform, Harvin had risen from his rigid posture. He leaned forward, gripping the railing with both hands, his eyes locked on the small structure Liam had built. The medic beside him murmured something, but Harvin did not answer. His gaze remained fixed, analyzing every detail of the human's improvised hut. He watched as Liam rested briefly inside it, then adjusted a few pieces of bark near the entrance to enhance the shade. Harvin's expression changed. Not quite pride, not quite surprise, but a mixture of understanding and respect. This was what he had expected from a human. Not brute endurance, not blind stubbornness, but adaptation, cleverness, intuition sharpened by necessity. On the ground, the medics had paused as well. Several stood near the cooling tents, their eyes drawn toward the hut. Some exchanged confused glances, unable to comprehend what the human had done. One medic, a reptilian man with deep green scales, tilted his head as if trying to make sense of the strange structure. To most species present, the idea of building shelter had never crossed their minds during a trial. The test was meant to measure endurance, not creativity. But Liam had changed the parameters. He had carved out a pocket of survival through ingenuity alone. Liam closed his eyes for a brief moment inside the hut, listening to his heartbeat as it slowly steadied. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease. For the first time since entering the arena, he allowed himself to relax just enough to think clearly. The trial was not over, but he had found his foothold. He had created a sanctuary in the middle of a battlefield. The heat still hovered around him like a living presence, but he now had the means to endure it. He sat in the dim shade, letting the coolness seep into him, and knew that the next stage of the trial would unfold on his terms. Liam remained inside the shelter long enough for his heartbeat to settle into something steady, though the air around him still pulsed with heat. His lungs ached with every breath, and sweat clung to his skin in a thin, salty film. Yet beneath the roof of branches and bark, the world was no longer a blinding inferno. The shade offered a faint but life-saving coolness, enough to restore clarity to his mind. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, blinked away the lingering dizziness, and listened to the muffled sounds outside. The distant hum of drones, the sharp clicks of medics reporting status updates, and the faint rustle of the hot wind dragging grains of sand across the ground. When he finally crawled out of the shelter, the sunlight struck him like a hammer. He winced, lowered his head, and stepped around the structure to inspect it from the outside. It stood slightly crooked, leaning against the slope of the shallow depression, but it held firm. The bark roof had darkened under the sunlight, absorbing the heat instead of letting it pass through. Liam pressed his palm lightly against it. The surface was burning hot, but the underside, he knew, remained survivable. Satisfied, he took a moment to study the horizon. The arena looked emptier now. Most cadets had been evacuated, leaving behind only footsteps, shallow marks in the sand, and abandoned shadows that stretched in molten silence. The medics no longer sprinted in chaotic directions. Instead, they grouped near the cooling tents, treating the last of the collapsed students. The observation platform was less crowded as well, though Instructor Harvin remained in his position, watching with an intensity that Liam could feel even from a distance. Liam sensed a shift in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. The trial was no longer a frantic struggle against time. It had entered a quieter phase, a phase where judgment mattered more than endurance. Still, the sun showed no mercy. Its light pressed down with the same unrelenting pressure, and the heat gnawed at his strength with every passing minute. He knew he could not simply remain idle inside the shelter. Even in shade, dehydration would continue its slow, inevitable work. He needed to ration his energy and water carefully, and he needed to reinforce the structure before the wind or shifting sun weakened it. He examined the angle of the shadows. The sun was drifting slightly westward, which meant the roof would need to extend lower on that side to prevent direct rays from piercing the interior. He returned to the shrubs and gathered more bark strips, though his fingers protested with sharp spikes of pain each time he pulled at the fibers. The sand scorched his knees as he knelt, and he gritted his teeth through the discomfort. While searching for usable branches, he found one cadet still conscious, a girl from the feathered species who had earlier tried to cool herself with fanning motions. She now sat slumped beside a patch of dry brush, her feathers drooping heavily. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Liam approached her cautiously, stopping several steps away. She raised her head slightly, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Her voice came out as a rasp, barely audible. "Is it cooler near the center?" Liam shook his head. "No, it is all the same. You need help." She blinked slowly, her feathers trembling. "I thought I could last longer," she whispered. "My instructor said my kind handles temperature swings well." Liam was careful to keep his tone steady. "Heat like this does not behave the way anyone expects." She nodded weakly, and he saw that she was at the edge of collapse. He waved toward the medics. One noticed him and rushed over with a cooling blanket. The medic lifted the girl and carried her away, leaving Liam alone again in the blazing field. He felt a pang of guilt for not having acted sooner, but he forced himself to push the feeling aside. He had to remain focused. Every mismanaged emotion drained energy he could not spare. He returned to the shelter just as the wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of hot dust. He reinforced the western side of the structure with extra bark strips, weaving them between the branches to create a thicker barrier. The work was slow and clumsy. His hands trembled each time he raised them. Still, he persisted, tying strips of fibrous bark around the ends of branches to keep them aligned. When he finally crawled inside again, the interior was noticeably darker. The sunlight filtered through in muted, smoky tones, and the air felt several degrees cooler than before. He settled onto the sand and let the shade embrace him. His breath steadied, his shoulders relaxed. He could feel the heat still radiating off the ground, but the burning sensation on his skin had faded enough for him to think clearly. Minutes passed, though he could not tell exactly how many. The shelter felt timeless, suspended between exhaustion and survival. Eventually, he heard the hum of a drone lower itself directly above his position. A soft mechanical beep echoed through the air. He looked up at the entrance and saw a drone hovering with its lens pointed at him. The drone emitted a short tone, followed by the synthesized voice of an instructor. "Cadet Liam, do you require medical evacuation?" Liam shook his head, raising his voice enough for the drone's microphone to capture. "No, I am conscious and stable." The drone paused, then emitted a confirming beep before rising back into the sky. Liam knew the Academy took safety seriously. The drone had likely been dispatched to ensure he was not using the shelter to hide signs of fatigue. He was grateful for the check-in, but part of him was determined to prove that he could finish this on his own. He allowed himself a few more minutes to rest before emerging again. When he stepped into the sunlight, the heat hit him with a violent blast, but his body had regained just enough strength to withstand it. He scanned the arena and noticed that the long shadows of the observation platform stretched farther now, hinting that the sun had shifted significantly. He would need to adjust the structure again soon, but before doing so, he wanted to test the effectiveness of the shelter from a distance. He walked several meters away and observed the shape, noting how the roof sloped unevenly, yet effectively blocked the sunlight. The entrance sat at an angle just wide enough for airflow, but not wide enough for direct rays to enter. The roof was thickest where the sun was strongest, forming a natural barrier that looked almost intentional, though he had built it through instinct rather than calculation. He crouched and felt the sand beneath his fingers. It burned him instantly, forcing him to withdraw his hand. He frowned. The longer he stayed outside the shade, the more dangerous the situation became. He needed to return to the shelter quickly. Yet before he reached it, a voice echoed across the arena, amplified by the speakers on the observation platform. It was Instructor Harvin. "The remaining cadet is to hold position. Medics on standby." Liam paused and turned toward the platform. Harvin's posture had changed. He now stood with his hands gripping the railing tightly, as though restraining himself from climbing down. His voice carried a tone of controlled urgency. "Cadet Liam, you are approaching the final threshold. Remain alert. The trial will conclude soon." Liam nodded, though he doubted Harvin could see the gesture clearly from such a distance. He re-entered the shelter and sat in the deepest part of the shade. The relief washed over him again, though fatigue began to settle into his bones in a heavy, lingering way. His water flask felt lighter than before. He shook it once and heard the faint slosh of what little remained. He hesitated but decided to take another sip. The water tasted warm and metallic, but it eased the rawness in his throat. He leaned back against the slanted wall of the hut, feeling the uneven texture of bark and branches pressing into his skin. He let his thoughts drift. He wondered what the instructors thought of his actions. He wondered what the medics said when they saw the hut. He wondered how the other cadets would react when they learned that he had endured the trial by building shelter rather than forcing his body through brute exposure. He imagined the feathered girl waking in the cooling tent, hearing the instructors discuss the human who had refused to treat the arena as a test of suffering. He imagined the chitin-plated boy clicking his mandibles in surprised amusement, perhaps realizing that endurance did not always mean resistance, but adaptation. These thoughts steadied him, giving him purpose beyond simply surviving. The hum of the wind grew slightly stronger, and the bark roof shifted with a soft creak. Liam adjusted himself, bracing the structure with his shoulder. He listened to the sand sliding across the roof, each grain tapping faintly like flecks of heated glass. Then, suddenly, the speakers crackled again. Harvin's voice rang out, clearer and louder than before. "The heat trial has reached its conclusion. Cadet Liam, remain seated. Medics inbound." Liam exhaled, a long, slow breath filled with relief and pride. He remained still inside the dim shade of the hut he had built with his own hands. The medics approached at a run, their reflective uniforms shimmering under the burning sun. As they reached the shelter, one of them knelt at the entrance, eyes wide in disbelief. "He built this?" the medic asked aloud, her voice thick with astonishment. The others murmured in agreement as she extended a hand toward Liam. He accepted it, pulling himself out of the hut with careful movements. His legs wobbled, and his vision blurred momentarily, but he remained conscious. The medics steadied him on both sides before guiding him toward the cooling tents. As he walked, he glanced back once. The hut stood quietly in the heat, casting its imperfect but stubborn shadow across the sand. It looked small and crude compared to the vast arena around it, yet in that moment, it seemed like the strongest structure in the world, not because of its materials, but because of what it represented: ingenuity, will, and a refusal to surrender to a challenge that demanded more than endurance. He continued toward the cooling tent as the sun blazed overhead, unaware that his small shelter had already become the center of an unfolding conversation. one that would shake the assumptions of the Academy long after the trial ended. Liam sat on the edge of the cooling cot, breathing deeply as the chilled air washed over him in slow, steady waves. The medics had wrapped a thin sheet of temperature-reactive fabric around his shoulders, and the material sent a tingling coolness across his overheated skin. His heart rate had settled, but exhaustion clung to him like a heavy cloak. Even so, he held himself upright. He did not want to lie back. He wanted to stay present, to understand what the conclusion of the trial meant. The cooling tent hummed with quiet activity as medics moved between the recovering cadets, checking vitals and updating records. Soft voices murmured reassurance to those who had only begun to regain consciousness. The scent of sterile cloth mixed with faint traces of minerals from the cooling mist that drifted through the room. Liam exhaled and closed his eyes for a moment. His muscles still trembled from dehydration, though the worst of the heat had faded. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Instructor Harvin standing at the entrance of the tent. Harvin stepped inside without hesitation, his boots making a dull thud on the reinforced floor panels. His uniform was immaculate despite the long hours under the sun, and the silver insignia on his chest reflected the tent's faint lighting. His expression remained stern, but something warmer flickered in his eyes, something that carried the weight of recognition. He approached Liam's cot slowly, as though giving the human time to register the interaction. Liam straightened instinctively, though the movement sent a small jolt of discomfort through his abdomen. Harvin noticed, but did not comment. "You stayed conscious longer than expected," Harvin said, his voice low and steady. "The medical report indicates severe dehydration bordering on heat strain, but your vitals are stable now." Liam nodded, unsure if he was supposed to respond verbally or simply listen. Harvin continued, folding his hands behind his back. "Your shelter was unexpected, effective, ingenious. The Academy has never documented such an approach during this trial." Liam allowed himself a slow smile, though he kept his tone respectful. "It was the only way to continue. I could not endure the heat directly." Harvin inclined his head. "That is precisely the point. You changed the nature of the trial through adaptation. Most cadets assumed the test required withstanding the environment. You examined the environment and redefined the problem." Liam lowered his gaze briefly, feeling a mix of pride and lingering uncertainty. Before he could respond, Harvin added, "You achieved something valuable today. Not only success, but a demonstration of human intuition that many here underestimate." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Your performance will be used as instructional material for future classes." Liam blinked in surprise. The idea that his decision, born out of desperation and half-remembered lessons from childhood, might shape teaching at the Academy felt surreal. Harvin stepped back slightly, giving him space. "Rest here until the medical officers clear you. Afterward, report to the main hall. A formal debriefing will take place." The instructor turned and exited the tent, leaving Liam alone with the soft hum of machinery and the faint rustle of medics moving between cots. Liam sat quietly for several minutes. The cool air helped revive him, bringing clarity back to his thoughts. He remembered the faces of the cadets who had collapsed, faces filled with determination and fear. He wondered how they would react to his success. Would they resent him? Would they feel embarrassed? Or would they be curious? He did not know, but he hoped they would understand that survival was not a competition of suffering. It was a test of mindset. Eventually, a medic approached him with a portable scanner in hand. She checked his temperature, heart rate, and hydration levels with practiced efficiency. Her serpentine eyes, a bright shade of amber, softened as she read the results. "You are recovering properly," she said. "You can stand now, but move slowly." Liam followed her instruction and swung his legs over the side of the cot. As he stood, a brief wave of dizziness washed over him, but it faded quickly. The medic steadied him with a hand on his elbow, then released him once she confirmed he had regained balance. "You may leave," she said. "The debrief will begin soon." Liam thanked her quietly and stepped out of the cooling tent. The arena had been cleared. The boundary pylons no longer glowed, and the sand had settled into undisturbed ripples. His shelter still stood at the edge of the depression, a crooked silhouette against the harsh sunlight. It looked smaller now, almost fragile, but it remained intact. Liam felt a faint warmth in his chest at the sight. He took one last look at the structure before turning toward the Academy's main complex. The walk to the debriefing hall was slow. The corridors were cool, lined with translucent panels that glowed with soft blue light. Cadets who had already recovered walked past him, some whispering quietly. When he entered the hall, several heads turned. The room was arranged in ascending rows, with instructors seated behind a long table at the front. Harvin stood beside them, waiting. Liam took a seat near the center. A few cadets glanced at him with expressions he could not read. Curiosity, perhaps, or confusion. No one seemed resentful. That eased him slightly. When Harvin stepped forward, the room fell silent. His presence commanded attention effortlessly. He began by reviewing the metrics of the trial, the temperature records, the rate of collapse, the medical responses, and the performance analysis of each participant. His tone was methodical, but his eyes occasionally flicked toward Liam. After summarizing the data, he shifted into evaluation. "This year's heat trial has revealed a critical gap in our training approach," Harvin said. "Most cadets relied on biological adaptation or prior conditioning. Few considered environmental manipulation as a viable survival strategy." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. One cadet re-examined the purpose of the trial and responded with creativity rather than brute endurance. A murmur ran through the room. Several cadets looked directly at Liam now, their expressions intensifying with interest. Harvin continued, pacing slowly before the assembled group. Cadet Liam built a shelter from available natural materials. This action altered his exposure, reduced heat intake, and preserved hydration. His survival was not the result of superior physiology, but superior problem-solving. A cadet in the back row, a tall student with silver-tinted skin, raised his hand. Harvin nodded at him. "Instructor," the cadet said, "was building a structure permitted under the rules? The guidelines forbid equipment, but not the use of natural surroundings." Harvin clasped his hands behind his back. "Correct. The trial forbids tools brought from outside the arena. It does not forbid initiative." Liam felt the tension in the room shift. He sensed admiration forming alongside surprise. The feathered girl who had collapsed earlier offered him a small, grateful smile. He returned it. Harvin resumed speaking. "Cadet Liam's actions represent the core of true survival training. Understand the threat. Reduce its impact. Use the environment. Do not surrender control to the elements. Adaptation is not passive. It is active." His voice deepened. "We will update our curriculum to reflect this." A few cadets clapped softly, uncertain if applause was appropriate. Harvin lifted a hand, holding the room quiet. Then he turned to Liam. "Cadet Liam, step forward." Liam rose slowly and approached the front of the hall. He stopped at the foot of the stage, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Harvin regarded him with a steady, approving gaze. "You have passed the heat trial with distinction," Harvin said. "You remained conscious longer than any participant today, and you demonstrated resourcefulness under extreme pressure. On behalf of the Academy, I commend you." Liam bowed his head slightly, unsure of what else to do. Harvin nodded once and stepped back. "You may return to your seat." Liam walked back to his row, the atmosphere noticeably warmer, emotionally, not physically. Cadets leaned toward him, whispering quietly. Some asked how he knew to build the shelter. Others asked if humans trained regularly under intense heat. He answered as best he could, though each question reminded him of how rare his approach had been in this environment. After the debriefing ended, Liam left the hall and stepped onto the balcony overlooking the arena. The sun still shone fiercely, but from here its light felt distant, filtered through the safety of structural glass. The arena below seemed almost quiet, no longer a place of trial, but a place of understanding. He looked at his shelter one final time. It would be cleared soon, dismantled and swept away with the rest of the trial's remnants. Yet the memory of it would linger. Harvin would add it to the Academy archives. Cadets would study it. Maybe the next group would think differently when entering the arena. Liam rested his hands on the railing. The heat trial had started as an ordeal, but it had ended as something more. A moment where instinct and ingenuity had shaped the path forward. He felt the last traces of fatigue ease from his limbs as a gentle breeze drifted across the balcony. The sun still burned above the desert, relentless and brilliant, but Liam no longer felt the weight of its judgment. He had proven himself, not by enduring the sun, but by outthinking it. He turned away from the balcony and walked back into the academy, ready for whatever challenge came next. The chapter had closed with certainty, leaving no unfinished questions behind, only the quiet confidence of a cadet who had earned his place by trusting the strength of his own mind.